Charlie Bradley. What's puzzled me and intrigued me is in fact the Anzac story. Not so much Anzac, the Gallipoli campaign itself, but why was it that second cousins of mine, and there were three in one family who went from suburban Adelaide, one died and one lost his leg, and the other one probably lost his mind, but certainly came back. And a farmer from Raceback near Picton died with shrapnel. It seems to me that they went enthusiastically. In the reports of their death, they were regarded as more than heroes. And then, after the Second World War, when I became adult, with the notion of the approach to warfare and so on declined, and now it has come again. I mean, the real question in my mind, why were they so enthusiastic to go over there? And what does it have for the Anzac story?
Thank you for the question. I suppose there are many reasons why people went. My area of expertise isn't military history at the time. I could talk about perhaps why there has been an Anzac revival, but in terms of why they went so willingly, I can only speak, probably like you, with personal anecdotes from my granddad who fought in World War II, and he'd been a boundary rider and he wanted an adventure, and he wanted to see the world, and this was a chance to do that. I imagine other people went for all sorts of reasons, to fight for the empire, to fight for Britain, to fight for white Australia, or to fight for multiculturalism and to fight against Hitler. I think there are all manner of reasons why people signed up and were, felt like they fought a good war, or perhaps felt like they had fought a terrible and endless war.
Yeah, I was raised by my grandmother, who was of Aboriginal descent through the White Australia policy, through the Second World War. She was a very racist woman herself at the end of that. So I guess in my upbringing had a very big sense of winners and losers in terms of history, and the winners write the history books and etc. I then married a man from north-western Sydney, from a very conservative family, and once again saw that kind of play out, that being a winner is very much what it's about. I see that in sort of the rise of gambling in our society, that black and white thinking that seems to be coming in more and more. And I've now got a 14-year-old son who also, like, when I was a kid, we were Labor voting family, but I swung to the left even more so, you know what I mean? I rejected my grandmother's racism. I chose to do things differently. My son's come from me, so he has another sense, but it's still that thing, like, now everyone's a winner. Everyone's a winner. Everyone's got to be a winner. And just in terms of history, I wonder how to express the concepts you're talking about, and this and the gravity and this kind of stuff to a generation where everyone's a winner. How do you, and also like just what we're looking at the moment with the possibility of going to war, it freaks me out. But sorry, I think that's the best I can put it. Cheers.
I think we do live in times where certain notions are put forward to try and compensate for a system that is highly competitive, that creates quite a great deal of polarisation and so forth. I think we live in a time where there are certain attempts to reconcile us to the sense that how can I put it, that the economic system is a sort of state of nature, and we've got to perform very, very well in a highly competitive and quite aggressive marketplace. And we can see that everywhere. We've used the word marketplace, have pervaded everything from ideas right through to to the sport, and so forth. And I think this, this notion of winners, or that that the next big win is just around the corner, is one way of bringing people to accept that their current situation is tough. I think we live in a period, materially...
Howard used it perfectly.
Yeah, we live in a period where materially, in terms of the sort of the technology and other advances we have at our disposal, are sort of historically unprecedented. But, in terms of the sort of opportunities and the capacity to sort of subsist, to reproduce, and to live a sort of healthy and healthy, not just in terms of sort of health, but mentally healthy and spiritually healthy life, is becoming harder and harder all the time. And so I think that one way of trying to reconcile people to this reality is these sort of notions of the next big win, or that it doesn't matter whether you are a winner, it's the fact that you're participating that's important.
How do we speak to young people to continue for that?
Well, I think we really need to talk about what are our shared common sort of needs, and in what way do we collectively, in what way collectively can we think about the future rather than as individuals? And this notion of winning and so forth is a very individual notion. But if we talk about things collectively, and in terms of what our community, what's best for community or society at whole, I think we can start to rein in some of that notion of individuality, of what's in it for me and how can I be a winner. Because in fact, whether it's right or not, there is a sense that we live in a zero-sum sort of existence. That is, some win at the expense of others.
So when everyone's a winner, then it becomes a collective.
Yeah. But the reality is not everyone's a winner. Far from it. And if we look at the recent inequality statistics that have come out, in fact, many people are losing, quite dramatically.
And my only addition to that as a historian would be, at that same time, the collective discourse of mateship and so on is on the rise as well. And maybe that's to cover up for the growing inequality and so on.
And you have the next question, please.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for like that. Okay. Thanks to both of you for really good presentations. I've got two questions. One to Anna. I kind of felt that your self-admitted fence sitting is not so much fence sitting, and that in fact, if we go back and look at what Howard did in terms of the way he changed curriculum and really brought out a kind of, developed a public ideology of, the digger and mateship and all that kind of thing. And it's really gone right through the curriculum. So I do think that there is an idea that history is value-free, right? And I think that that's very strong within the society generally, that history is quite value-free. So I'd like you to sort of comment on that a bit more, because the idea of critique and dissent is something that is not a very strong value actually in our society. So that's one of the issues there. But then going over to Noah, the idea that we might be winning the culture, the culture struggle, maybe it's not a war as such, but in some ways you've kind of, you were saying that the economic side of things, the economic person, the marketplace and everything, and particularly with this recent government and the budget, there is an ideology that emerges from that, and then you've actually talked about it, in terms of individualism and how that's become quite strong. So I kind of feel there is a little bit of contradiction, in what you're saying, because on the one hand you're saying that, we have become very economically oriented, and if you look at even we as academics, our students have become consumers, right? And that's how we actually teach these days to consumers, and so in a way we're reproducing a lot of the problems.
Thank you for that question. It's a very interesting point, and I think it brings up a really interesting sort of historical, the strategy or the manoeuvrings of history in relation to whether history is value-free or not. As you rightly said, when Howard initiated the first attempt to write a national curriculum for Australia, it was basically proposing an Australian narrative that was, as you say, value-free. And I think that's what Christopher Pyne is trying to allude and get back to, is that sense of, basically things were okay, basically this is a narrative of progress, let's sort of make a nod to some of the terrible things that happened in our history, but basically history is about teaching young Australians to be proud of Australia. What I find very interesting in response to that is when I was doing interviews with school children around the country, I interviewed about 200 kids from all around the country about Australian history, and overwhelmingly they loathe Australian history when it's value-free. They don't want to learn the same old stuff, the same old tired narrative, and the way they learn and enjoy history is engaging with subjectivity and debate and contest, and they want debates in the classroom, and they want their teachers to disagree, and they want, as a gentleman came up to me before, who was talking about a history lecturer arguing from different perspectives. That's what they want in the classroom, because they know actually that history is not value-free, that history is inherently subjective, and that's what makes it interesting and engaging. So I think there are two things going on there that are quite interesting.
I agree. I mean, I as much as I can, I rebel against this notion of students as consumers, but yes, it's everywhere, and so it is hard to do. But I guess when I say we've won the culture wars, in a sense I think that we've been allowed to win in some areas, if that makes any sense, because as we have those small victories over issues like the way that we intolerance and other issues, I think I'll use the word distracts from some other material debates, or debates about the economy and distribution of wealth and all those other issues that seem to be off entirely out of bounds for most commentators. Now, I don't think that's a generalisation, and there are people out there who are arguing against many of the taken for granted notions around the economy and so forth. But I think the public debate really has been silent on a number of key issues. If I can give an example, Corey Barnardi's, he's a very extreme example, but his comments on Q&A about homosexuality and bestiality, I think, they were very extreme. But what they did at the time was reorient everyone to the reactionary nature of the Liberal Party over this issue, and it did dominate the press for a few days. It was at the same time that the Coalition released a number of statements about economic reform in Australia, which went under the radar. Now, I'm not saying it was done that instrumentally, but if you're continuing to create controversy over areas like bigotry, sexuality and so forth, then it does give you a lot more space to make economic changes that might otherwise be contested in the public sphere. And that's why I think that comment from those Egyptian students really resonated with me, because I think it does happen quite often that you get this controversy over something important. Let's not deny that those comments were heinous and completely unacceptable. But at the same time, it did provide cover for other debates to sort of go unnoticed, or other issues to go unnoticed. And I guess that's where I see this sort of thing happening. I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess, yeah.
Next question.
My name's Frank Stillwell, and my question concerns myths, useful myths and harmful myths. I congratulate you both for your presentations, and I'm particularly interested in this argument that the left is able to win in the territory of culture wars while the right is dominating the economic agenda and pulling the carpet out from under the material conditions on which our well-being depends. I think it's a very interesting argument, and particularly when you link it to the question about when myths are useful. Because you referred, Noah, to the notion of egalitarianism in Australia as being a useful myth. Yes, it's inconsistent with what's really happening to the distribution of income and wealth, but it gives us some strength, some solidarity, some basis on which we may try to pursue an alternative agenda. I don't quite know how we pursue that alternative agenda, but in the unlikely event of a left-wing government coming to power, presumably that could be one avenue. But while you were talking, I started to think about the American equivalent, you know, the land of the free, American exceptionalism, the right to police the rest of the world because there's just a whole lot of bad guys out there doing crook things and they need us to keep them all in order. That too is a myth about the land of the free, but it has a particular use in justifying that global policeman role. So I'd like you both, if you wouldn't mind, to comment a little bit more about when myths are useful and when they're harmful.
I think the myth is as let's say, harmful or as useful as the hands that use or the people that use it. I mean, that doesn't really answer it, but I mean, those, you know, as Anna said, I mean, we are talking about very contested notions, and you know, the mythologies have both very positive and negative elements. I mean, we talk about the I talked about the egalitarian myth, but of course that covers up a great deal of inequality in Australia, not least the inequality towards Indigenous people, but also towards migrant labour and etc. So the myth serves a certain purpose, and it was, I guess, a myth that bound the dominant sort of Australian community together. But of course, it left a lot of people out of it. I guess. But I mean, you know, because all these things are contested and they're shaped and reshaped, they're fluid at times, it does mean that we can. I mean, this is something that I've come to believe quite strongly, especially with notions of other identities, ethnic and others, that because they're shaped and reshaped historically by a whole range of forces, that if they're shaped negatively, and we talk about Israelis and Palestinians at the moment, they can also be reshaped positively. And I think we can try to think about how we reshape some of these myths positively as well, to maybe be of benefit to us as a society, and to think about how collectively they can reshape the sort of relationships we have with each other. That's where I come from when I think about that idea.
Mine might be more cynical than that. Thanks, Frank, and I'd like to acknowledge I'm a political economy dropout. That's despite your valiant efforts in the late 1990s. My colleague Ben Spies-Butcher was a political economy success story who went through under your tutelage. I sort of see myths useful as a pedagogical device in teaching, basically. I'm very struck when I go to an Anzac Day service or so on, which I go partly as research and partly out of interest. And I find them terribly, terribly moving. And I, cry, and I hear the last post and, fall apart and so on. But at the same time as that's happening and the people march by and so on, there's another voice in my head, and I don't know what sort of voice it is or where it comes from, but it's a critical voice saying, what's this all for? Who's doing it? Who is allowed to be here? Who's not welcome? Who's part of this narrative? Who isn't part of this narrative? And I think that's where myths are very interesting and useful in a classroom situation. And because we need to ask our students, and by that could mean that in a literal sense, and also in a sort of broader sense of the wider public. We want everybody who goes to those Anzac ceremonies, or to think about some of those national myths as who, why, where, who not, who can't, who isn't here, and who can be a digger, who can't be a digger, who is a mate, who isn't a mate, and so on. And I think the utility of myths, for me, is more a sort of entry point into critical thinking and inquiry.
Well, I'm going to ask the next question. And it's an experience that a lot of you were here when it happened to me. I had a light bulb moment when Malcolm Fraser spoke here a few weeks ago, and he was dealing with the refugee issue, and he's an extreme critic of both of the government and of the opposition for their current policy on refugees, which most of us would take the same stand. But he did something that I've never heard any other advocate for a refugee justice do. What he did a short historical narrative. He took us back to what his policy was, or what Australia's policy was at the time of the Vietnam boat people. And he reminded us what I think most of us actually have forgotten. So this is my question of narrative. That at that time, 80,000 Vietnamese refugees, boat people, came to Australia and were settled in a completely humanistic way. There were no detention camps. The government, anticipating this would happen, had already made plans with NGOs to have the people coming to be placed in towns where their labour was needed, mainly country towns. Arrangements had already been made in the public school system, so as soon as the refugees came, they simply went to a holding centre for a very short time, just to be checked out for Interpol and illness. And they were then placed in country towns, in houses. Their children went to public schools, there was work for these people, and as he said, there was no racism. There was none. And that was for that period. So I thought, my God, this is such a powerful story to tell that really answers all these sort of barbaric position that not only the Liberal Party is taking, but also I think the Labor Party is collusive over this. So I suppose my question is, why should we be using historical, are those of us on the left who are working in campaigns such as the refugees and many other, should we be thinking back to using historical narratives that show how things can be, not only that they can be done differently, but that they have been done differently historically? And the refugee example, I think, is the clearest one I know, and there'd be people here in this audience who would have heard the way Malcolm Fraser used a true historical narrative to say we did it more or less right, complete with a completely different value system. And nobody now in public life seems to use that. I think I'd like your comments about that use of historical narrative, or where we do things when we are protesting and trying to enter the public debate about terrible issues like the barbaric policy on refugees.
Okay, it's a very good question. We've also got to see that the early 1980s, late 1970s and 1980s are a far different time from the one we live in at the moment. I read an interesting piece a few months ago that argued that, in fact, racism in Australia has not been a working class phenomenon, but rather an elite-driven one. It was a very persuasive piece, and it sort of, in many ways, challenges our sort of, I guess our intuition on this. And I tend to agree that we're seeing now a discourse here that's largely been driven at by political and economic elites. Now, okay, that doesn't answer your question, but I think we have to approach this period differently to the way that Malcolm, Fraser and others approached the refugee issue in the 1970s and 80s. And the other difference is, there are two other differences. One is that we were involved in the Vietnam War. The refugees from Vietnam were seen as political refugees, asylum seekers in the traditional sense, fleeing a communist state and being on the other side of the sort of international struggle, ideological struggle. We supported those who fled the barbarism of communism. And the other thing is, we are now largely talking about refugees who are, on the whole, Muslim, and I think that has played a large part in the way that they're being perceived in the public sphere. Now, okay, how do we go about dealing with this? I think history is a useful way of, because and there is a narrative there about the Australia that migrants have contributed to. I mean, many of the migrants who came post-World War II came by boat. Most of them came without papers, without passports. They were people who fled the horrors of World War II or were fleeing the aftermath of World War II. So, that sort of narrative I think we should be reconstructing and reminding the rest of Australia about, and not just about the fact that we now have multiple food options, but the fact that the contribution is much deeper and much richer. We have a much richer society because of it. And I think if we can build that narrative, maybe we can start to reconstruct the way that the public or the sort of mainstream view of refugees is discussed. But I mean, that's a very hopeful idea, but one that I think a project that we certainly should be involved in.
Yes, I'm struck by a response by Kevin Rudd, which sort of precipitated his perhaps public downfall, where he said, I'm not ashamed to say that I want a big Australia. And it really struck me, the response that was generated to that comment, that there's sort of a narrowing of an Australian consciousness, as if our wealth is precarious and, like you're saying, a zero-sum game. My sort of feeling is it's not just about a historical narrative that can be told here, but also a human one. And the sort of great strength of that anti-refugee campaign is that it's ultimately dehumanising. And when you start to identify with the people involved as people, that's when it's very hard to carry on that negative campaign. And I don't know how that can happen, but I think that's also key. It's not just a historical narrative that needs to be told, but a human story.
The historical narrative was one, actually, of humanism.
Next question, please.
And then
my name is Bruce Thomas. I'd like to question the non-acceptance of the contribution of communists in Australian history. Now, well, it goes back a long way, but most recently, the contribution of Ted Mabo to the challenging of the concept of terra nullius, ignoring 60,000 years of Aboriginal history. And I've spent a bit of time in Townsville, where Ted Mabo lived. Maybe still does. I've spoken to communists in Townsville, and that's basically Ted was a member of the party. You don't hear this very often. But, of course, the mass media, the capitalist media, doesn't publicise good things about those who oppose capitalist ideology. So maybe I've got the answer to my question. But anyway, why do you think this attitude towards communists exists in the media and in Australian life?
Really don't know. I guess it's all tied in with our economic system, our close alliance with Britain, and then the US and the Cold War. But really, it's not something I can answer. I know there are a couple of people in Sydney, Drew Cottle and a few others who have written on the issue, but certainly it's outside of my area of expertise. But it's certainly a good question.
Next question, please.
Yeah, Brian Cannon. I've done quite a lot of research myself into history and all the wars, and I come across the same thing over and over again, that the banksters are responsible for all the wars, in their quest for their one world government, new world order. Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Libya, all had their own national bank or Islamic banking. And once attacked and taken over, invaded, they quickly installed their own usury central bank. The main countries in the to be attacked: Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela. That they've all got their own central bank. I'd just like to know your thoughts on the link between the central bankers, their one world government, new world order, and installing their central banks everywhere to get their quest.
I don't know if it's banks, but certainly a number of countries that have been, I guess, listed as targets by, Wesley Clark for one, all have one thing in common, is that they all have barriers to private capital. Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, a number of others. Now, whether that's banks or whether it's just the nature of the dominance of global capitalism, that's a different... But I think that we can say that since the end of the Cold War, most US sort of activities, international activities, has been focused on breaking down barriers to global capital, and especially to US capital expansion. There are a lot of people who argue that certainly it's not certainly something that that I can claim authorship over. But I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if it's banks or rather a more structural, a deeper structural and ideological project.
Fergus McPherson. It seems to me that there's a disproportionate asymmetrical response from the establishment to history wars versus class war. Whenever there's a history war on, the progressives get very agitated about it. But whenever progressives start to talk about inequality, they're accused of waging a class war. Should we be less intimidated?
It's a lovely observation. I think it's helpful to look at some of the strategies of some of the main characters in the history wars, and if I can take sides for a minute before going back to my fence. One of the interesting things I think about a lot of the way that conservative commentators and politicians have fought or contributed to the history wars is to claim the middle ground. And in effect, they've shifted the goalposts so that anybody who is to the left of them is actually extreme because they occupy the balanced view. And so, of course, if someone talks about class or anything, that suddenly becomes a left-wing issue rather than a national issue or a political issue and so on. And it's a very interesting observation.
The only thing I would add is that I remember a headline in the Telegraph about a decade ago that read, it was big letters, as you can imagine, there are no more classes in Australia. There's no class in Australia. And I think that summed up the sort of view. I think we are intimidated, and we saw that in the last election. But certainly it's, Terry Eagleton makes the point that class is relevant. and we should start to discuss class identities once again. I mean, if we're living in an era that tells us anything, then one thing it does tell us is that class is clearly out there and something that we should be engaging. So, yes, less intimidation. Yeah.
How many more questions do we have?
How many hands have we got? 1, 2, 3. 3 arms this way.
And okay, so we have 3 more questions.
Hello?
Oh, 4.
Hello?
Okay.
This doesn't seem to be on.
Anna has to leave
Yes,
in about
hello.
5 minutes. Let me just say, yeah, if you have a question for Anna, then we will give them priority because Anna has to leave in about 5 minutes. Not because she finds questions too difficult, I hasten to say, but because of what I call the pressures of family life. She has to go and pick up her kids.
Question for Anna.
Oh, put them to bed. That's even harder. That's even harder. Yeah. But we have all been through that. And we are happy that it's all behind us. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Susan Wicks. There was discussion earlier about why people went to war. And I was really surprised, both Anna, for you, that there was no remembrance that there were no jobs prior to both Second World War, First World War, and probably previous ones, because there weren't any jobs. And as far as I can see, people joined the army and went to war to get a job. And to put their children to bed. And to put their children to bed.
That feels like a war to me sometimes, believe me. Thank you for that comment. That's absolutely true, of course. And if you think of the major depressions in Australia being the 1890s and in the 1930s, that's certainly an important point to reflect on. And also the fact that, particularly after World War I, there weren't many jobs to come back to. And you think of the soldiers who came back and were offered land and never managed to make it work and so on. There's a sort of history of depression, if not economic depression, and certainly social depression after the war as well that I think needs to be remembered.
Right, now we've got 15 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to get everybody with their question, but who's another Anna question? Or comment? Anybody for Anna?
The only thing that our 2 speakers said tonight where I would have some disagreement with was when Anna criticised a lot of the response to Kevin Rudd's proposal about a big Australia. Certainly I think that a lot of the criticism was valid. Certainly a lot of the misgivings about that, although certainly not all of it, would come from ecological considerations about the problems of a large fragile continent like Australia. But that also relates to my question, which is it's largely big business interests, obviously, which would have big motivation for the idea of having a large population, so more consumption and so on. So my question is actually about more in the field of economics. One thing which the right has long treated as gospel and the left never really seems to question is this idea that we must have economic growth, constant economic growth. So my question is, why is it something which the left hasn't really taken up in recent years? Like the idea of having, say, a steady state economy, instead of, full growth all the time. Why has that fallen off the agenda for the left?
Another good question, a very good question. Again, I think it comes back to this notion that there are certain uncontested ideas, there are certain ideological assumptions that left and right have now agreed on, and I think most of the terrain of neoliberalism is out of bounds. I think that's term used earlier. The real question is a question of distribution, not growth. but it's a question that no one in the public sphere is willing to engage in. And I agree with you. I think we can have a debate. The only thing I'd say very, very quickly about the opponents of Big Australia, I mean, some of those use the cover of the ecological debate to mask some other reasons. I mean, I'm thinking of Jim Salem as one who came out against Big Australia on the basis that our environment was precious and we couldn't sustain a larger population. What he's really saying is, if we were going to have a migration, a largely white migration to Australia, then that would be fine. But since the reality is most people who come to Australia would be Asian or from elsewhere, he was going to oppose it. And so I think we have to be a bit careful about the people who put forward the ecological argument against the Big Australia, because not all of them were concerned with the environment here in Australia, the actual physical environment.
Now, is there one more genuine Anna question? Because that wasn't quite genuine, Anna. Here we are. You've waited a long time, sir.
Okay, so this is for Anna. I take it you've looked into history teaching and the status of history education, and so my question is about the status of historical understanding across the body politic, and looking at two sides of that coin. One, the history curriculum, which in the late 80s and the early 90s planted just a triumphalist march of progress view of the winners with a more socially critical, skills-based and social history approach. I'm interested in the extent to which you think there are useful concepts and understandings across the body politic to engage in this sort of conflict-based view of history and the history wars, if you take that simplistic analysis on the one hand. And on the other hand, I don't know what the numbers are, but every time I go into a bookshop, it does seem to me historical publishing and populist publishing, the Carlines, Simons and Cornelius, as well as the academics, more specialist publications, seem to be pluralistic and healthy and so on, and the history channels and articles and so on, radio, TV. It seems to be a fairly healthy pluralist debate. I'm just wondering what your judgment would be about the quality of historical understanding, our capacity to engage in these debates in a critical and evidence-based kind of a way. How are we doing?
That's a very good question, and I think that sort of rise in popular history and heritage tourism and historical fiction and so on is at the same time that the history in schools seems to have suffer such stigma is a very interesting paradox in Australian history. In terms of the historical understanding in the broader Australian community, I actually think it's very high. And one of the things I find very interesting about the history wars, which I sort of alluded to in the talk there, is so why are we consuming such a simplistic public debate? Is it because it's entertainment? Because when I speak to people, they actually have quite sophisticated historical understandings, and they can understand that history is subjective, and they understand that historical values change over time, and these are skills of historical thinking or historical understanding that are quite specific and quite developed, if you like. But at the same time, there are sort of public figures and public commentators who advocate a much simpler version of the past. And so I'm very intrigued by that mismatch, if you like, between the historical understanding of ordinary people, if you like, and the sort of political nature of the debate. And I don't have an answer. I speculate that it's because people consume Andrew Bolt partly because they enjoy the entertainment factor, rather than because they adhere to that sort of simplistic political partisanship. That's my speculation.
Anna has to go now, so please thank Anna for her wonderful speech and all the wonderful answers. And also, please, we'll wish her good luck with her next task, daunting task of putting your kids to sleep. All the best. Now, Noah might stick around for another few minutes. So, can we have the next question, please?
Is there another question? Oh, yes, sorry. Hiding there in the corner.
Thanks very much to the panel. I think the real challenge that we face in history at the moment is to combat denialism. Denialism is what we're seeing in the climate debate. It's not it's rejection of all the evidence, rejection of all, and if history is in any sense a science, which is a question in itself, we're fighting a war of information and against the war. I mean, the question of myths, very quickly, where does the egalitarian, quote, myth come from? Well, it's from the diggers, it's from, Eureka Stockade, it's from the fact that Australia had the highest proportion of trade union membership in the world at one stage. I mean, I don't know whether these things are covered in history these days. I'd be interested to know the comment on that. Are these where do these myths come from? Where do these ideologies come from? From historical contest, from class struggle and so on. And the other thing is, I think the biggest challenge we face in the coming 12 months around the Anzac myth is to point out that the war itself was contested, that the Wobblies organised enormous rallies against the war, that we're the only country in the world that actually voted against conscription twice. I think, anyway, that's what I think is the big challenge we face in the history wars of the next period, is to actually take on these unhelpful myths and point out the reality of the struggle behind the helpful myths. So yeah, that's my alternative Anzac myth, is the story of the Wobblies and the trade union movement and the people who fought against the war. Thank you.
Yep, good one.
I can't answer a question about what's being taught in history. It's not my discipline, but I think one of the things that really strikes me, or one of the things that I think we have to sort of challenge also, and now that Anna's left, I think I can say this without the same fear that I had when she was here, is this notion of balanced. I think the term balanced has become largely used to allow very minority and views equal space in debate, and climate change is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
I mean, when we think about the minority of climate scientists who believe that climate change is not occurring, or that this is a natural phenomenon that has no bearing on the future, and how much space they're given in the public debate.
Yes.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is this word balanced, and it's a word that the conservatives have used in the media and elsewhere to allow quite minority views equal weight in the debate. And I mean, history and a whole range of other areas have suffered from this. Students come to me in first year and say, we want a balanced view on this. Well, in fact, I would rather see an informed view, not a balanced view.
Yes.
But the word balance has become so widely used and so pervasive, again, that use that word, that it really does cloud the way that people look at key issues. So, that's one term I would like to see everyone challenge more strongly. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but it gave me an opportunity to say something else that I wanted to say.
Next. Okay. If there are no more questions, please thank Noah for his wonderful talk, as well as all the wonderful answers he gave. Thank you.